Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Tonic Discussions. Last week we discussed national divorce. Eric and I didn't participate. This week we're here. We're going to continue the discussion. We are lacking Luke and Grant, but Mark, John, and Daniel are all here. So we're going to continue the discussion and then maybe go on to some other topics that connect in one way or another. And with that said, let's go. John, you were saying something.
Was I? Um, yeah. So in the kind of pre-discussion, like Mark brought up like kind of parallel systems as um, a, a way of avoiding the sort of like the political national divorce, right? Um, and the point that I was making is that in a sense, the U.S. already has two parallel systems right now. It has the old constitutional order and it's got the civil rights constitutional order, which are completely incompatible with one another down to the level of fundamental philosophical premises. And each side of this divide has a sort of religious attachment to their particular like preferred constitution, and tends to pay lip service to the other side. I mean, it's not a pure divide, right? I mean, like you'll find like most red state MAGA types will still say like, oh, the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or whatever, like there's still that kind of like they'll pay lip service in that way. And on the blue side, like, they'll still pay lip service, of course, to the original U.S. Constitution, but the deeper allegiances are um, to those two documents, and that incompatibility between them is a source, the primary source, I think, of the almost religious struggle which is emerging. Um, and this is increasingly being reflected in geographic boundaries too. So, especially post coronavirus, we've seen this internal migration where people are fleeing the blue states and going to the red states. And initially, people were quite worried that this would turn, Texas and Florida into like purple and then blue states. But the opposite seems to have happened. They've actually become more deeply red as that migration has gone on. So now people are starting to think, okay, what's actually happening is that the red state voters or the red voters in the blue states are abandoning the blue states and moving to red states. So you're seeing the political divide become a geographical divide, which probably does not bode well for the long-term political stability because you have now increasingly two like you have geographically distinct regions with very culturally and politically distinct populations who have fundamentally incompatible views about how the union should be set up. And we're seeing that, of course, replicated in the digital sphere as well. So we were also talking about, like during the pre-discussion, we were talking about um, the kind of fragmentation of the internet into all of these walled gardens, these little fiefdoms that are sort of separated off from them. So, for instance, Twitter, right? Twitter for the longest time was just like the public town square. And now it's increasingly becoming the red town square. It's just the biggest version of Gab and Truth Social. And at the same time, Meta just came out with Threads as a Twitter competitor, which apparently already has 100 million users because they just imported everyone from Instagram. And that's seeing very enthusiastic uptake from Democratic politicians and celebrities and so on. So it looks very likely that Threads ends up becoming effectively the blue Twitter. So, we're going to have these kind of like separate noetic zones inhabited by the separate populations who are going to have, to a certain degree, geographic separation from one another, and are going to be inhabiting completely distinct media and influence ecosystems, which, yeah, I mean, like I don't see how you heal that divide. It seems that they just end up growing further and further from one another as time goes on. And eventually you either have to have political separation or one hell of a power struggle. So with that, anyone?
If I could just jump in there for just a second, I think it's worth noting that the left in America has forsaken Martin Luther King. Like, I wouldn't say that he's actually become the founding document of the left, because they're very much a skin color is the only thing that matters. What's that?
That's a very conservative talking point, right? It's sort of the Democrats are the real racists, or we're the real defenders of the civil rights.
I'm not saying the civil rights in general. I'm saying that Martin Luther King in particular was very keen on, all of his speaking points are, how to merit, not the color of your skin, content of your character, your skills, being judged by merit, as opposed to the modern left, which is saying, merit is in of itself not a thing. And so we should be hiring only on skin color, that kind of deal. I just think we don't want to cede Martin Luther King Jr. to the left. They've gone way past that, and they're straight up saying
I don't know. I would. To me, it's always kind of looked like he was just kind of like the face that was there to appeal to the white liberal. Like the kid glove wrapped around the steel fist of Malcolm X. You can deal with the reasonable Martin Luther King Jr., or you can deal with the unreasonable Malcolm X, right? But they were sort of like, two parts of the same thing. And the deference with which Americans have been trained to regard Martin Luther King Jr., the supposed reverend, supposed doctor, plagiarist, and so on, communist operative, according to some, philanderer, whoremonger, and et cetera. This deference is, to a large degree, what is actually it's like an emotional protection for the civil rights regime, because it sort of gets the red side to kind of pull its punches all the time, because they don't want to offend the memory of the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Well, so I think there's a different way of looking at that, though. Because I agree with you. I don't want him as a son-in-law, but especially because he'd be a shambling corpse, and that would be horrifying at Thanksgiving. But even still, if you look at like the civil rights legislation and like bureaucracy and like the edifice that came out of that, right? It's very, very different in function and the reality of how it works from what he preached. And so on the one hand, I think you're right in a lot of ways that he was the more palatable face for the leftist view. People liked the palatable face, but what the palatable face is not what people got, and it's certainly not what they're getting now and what they're pushing now. You see what I mean? So it's sort of like saying, hey, this guy was nice, but this isn't anything like you. Let's separate those two a little bit. Instead of saying that he was what the left was, like, no, he was the good face. Everybody was okay with what he was selling for the most part. What actually got sold or purchased and what is being used now is something very, very different. And I think that's a useful point.
I saw Harrison's hand up, but I just wanted to interject something very quickly, and then hopefully Harrison could give us his take. I think what we're really talking about, though, is not palatable, unpalatable, but two different stories with two different characters. And so those stories,
yeah, exactly.
You need, like, in other words, people are struggling to find a national story, as they always are, a tribal story, a story that unifies and makes things coherent, so that they can look back and say, here's... And
it's 1776 and 1619, right? Where the 1619 story like is the one that sort of like, it goes from 1619 through the Holocaust camps, and then like it flowers in like 1964 with the Civil Rights Act and everything. And then the other story,
I think it's more ancient than that. It's more ancient than America. The two stories can be drawn back to, well, I would say the fall of Satan versus the dominion of God. Like, these are ancient beyond belief. Like, the idea of what kind of a story you're going to use as the foundation for whatever your civilization is. And I think that in the 60s, and particularly, like, that was unstable. People weren't sure what kind of story they wanted to, you had people flocking to one story on one hand with its own cast of characters, and another story on the other hand with another cast of characters, and they were in conflict. And now I think we've seen the result of who won, which story won. That's what we're living with today. And let me just hand that off to Harrison. Sorry, man. I just wanted to jump in there real quick.
Well, I wanted to sidestep this whole part of the conversation and go back to what John was saying about this kind of like geographical and digital divide that is forming. And I think this is almost even it will have a part to play in how things actually play out, and the dynamics and the structure of whatever conflict plays out over the next 10 years. But in a sense, it's kind of a secondary issue, in the sense that regardless of what happens, there are other things that are going to take place. So let's just say that for whatever reason, there is this, well, just imagine a very rapid and kind of definitive national divorce, in the sense of we get people moving, so we get higher concentrations and a higher polarization between different geographical regions. And let's just say that even manifests itself politically in a division into two versions of the United States, or more than that. That in itself, that's kind of just the clothes that are going to be worn, because those states, those new states, or those existing states that just in their new form, they're still going to have to deal with the issues that are kind of I'll go back to Peter Turchin, the kind of structural demographic issues that are contributing to the dynamics that we're seeing. So, for instance, we're going to get, let's say, the red country and the blue country, and they're each going to have their elite overproduction. They're each going to have too many elite aspirants. So even within a blue country, you're going to have the same. Not necessarily. It's not going to manifest exactly the same. It won't be the same kind of political struggle, but you're still going to have political struggles, and that is going to come to a head. And the only way, not the only way, but the most common way. No, what needs to happen, and what has always happened, is there needs to be a reduction in the numbers of this like overeducated elite aspirant class. And whether that happens through, like, historically, disease, death, war, or through just massive downward social mobility, that's going to be the only thing that solves the problem, that basically resets the system so that it can start again, and the symptoms can kind of cool down, so that for the next at least 50 years, there's going to be some a relative peace. And then if things are managed well, we won't see a second civil war in the next 50 to 60 years. And then it might be 100 or 200 years before the next big, the big breakup. But even just the notion of this divorce, whether it's geographical or political or both, that in itself, like, it won't solve anything. That will just be one of the things that happens as the problem gets worse, until the actual solution takes place, which is, one way or another, a massive reduction in the numbers of the 1% to the 10%. It's like a lot of those people are going to have to lose a lot of money, enter the lower class, or the dwindling middle class, to kind of repopulate that entire demographic. And historically, that's usually a violent process, and some of them, even if it isn't physically violent, may perceive it as economically violent. And that in itself, even in a totally blue country or a totally red country, is still going to play itself out one way or the other. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Nothing ever stops everything, or solves everything, right? I mean, every solution ends up causing its own problems. I think Turchin's sort of elite structural analysis is very relevant to precisely this red-blue divide. The red elite, in many ways, are the kind of frustrated emerging elite that are being blocked from advancement by the kind of like overpopulated blue elite. And that is, I think, one of the things which is precisely one of the things which is generating all of the sort of cultural conflict in the first place. I mean, you have like a lot of young guys, especially, who are being prevented from moving forward in their careers, being denied positions at universities. I mean, like, you all know the deal, right? And some fraction of them are finding alternative means of generating influence and status for themselves, setting themselves up as a rival elite. And of course, they're very ill disposed towards that kind of existing institutional elite who are entirely blue elite. So,
Well,
yeah,
but there's also blue elite aspirants that can't get in, because like the whole thing about the like Turchin's analysis of this is that there's a limited number, no matter what your color, your political color, and despite the fact that the majority or the full that are blue, you still got a ton of blues that want to get in on that.
A lot of what people call woke is essentially like a means of trying to regulate entry into the elite, which on the blue side, they sort of compete with one another to out woke each other. It turns into a purity spiral. So like, only the wokest can ascend. And then on the red side, it's like sort of the ones who like explicitly reject that and are just like, they're not trying to join the existing elite so much as increasingly like just talking about how do we become a counter elite and just replace them entirely. Exactly. So that's kind of the struggle that's going on there. Some people trying to climb the existing greasy pole, and others being like, why don't we just build a fucking ladder?
Well, there's two ways if I can jump in there, because I think on the one, I want to build on what you're saying, is that there's the question of what kind of elites a country has, right? So at the moment we have one country, we have blue is the elite, right? You have to be more woke. That's how you get up the pole, like you're saying, right? And so there's a lot of conflict around that. You can reduce a lot of conflict by saying, yeah, those guys aren't on, we break into red and blue. The red states say, yeah, these guys are no longer our elites. We have slightly different kinds of elites, but we like them better. Like they're elites for reasons that we can respect, right? You start moving and have more towards that prestige, feeling of a dominance hierarchy, right? So that's
exactly. If you read so last week, I just want to interject to the audience and you guys, if you didn't read Johann Kurtz's Teleocracy and Prestige, it is completely on point with this stuff. That's exactly what he's talking about. It's like, how do we, from a practical perspective, build a rival elite that actually exists on like sort of meritorious principles? It's good stuff. Okay, but go ahead.
And I want to say the other thing that's important to remember is that you actually can create more slots for elites. So in particular, when you break up countries, the United States elites don't compete with Canadian elites, right? Like we each have our own presidents. They're not fighting each other to become the Uber president, right?
Implying Canada has elites.
Technically, yes, they do. Are they good elites? Dear God, no. But hey, they have people that are in power and people listen to for some ungodly reason. But this is the thing, right? So as states merge and become larger single states, there's more spaces for people, but relative status goes down for everybody because there's still only one guy at the top, people below him, people below him, people below him, right? So if you have, if you think back to like post-Roman Empire, Western Europe breaks up. Now you have tons of little kingdoms. None of those kings have as much power as a provincial governor under Rome, but they also don't have anybody above them. And so by relative status within that smaller group, they're much more important and they're much more focused on their immediate group and that kind of prestige/dominance hierarchy. Right? You see the same thing with like music. After the advent of radio, you started getting national stars, right? Whereas before, when you had, and even in the very early days of radio, when you only had local radio stations, you had many like, oh, this is the best band in town. And this is the second best band in town. And oh, these are the guys that are musicians here. And maybe you hear of some like the local towns, but you didn't know what was going on the other side of the country. Once no one cares about the best band in town.
one way to kind of phrase that would be that from a strictly material basis, it's usually much better to be part of a much larger hierarchy. But from an emotional or psychological basis, at least as far as the elite go, it's kind of better to be the chieftain of a small tribe than it is to be like the village headman in a large empire, even though the village headman has like a much better standard of living from a material basis. It's also it's kind of similar to the whole thing with like a Gini coefficients, right? How people's happiness is more tied to their perceived relative level of wealth to others in their society than it is to kind of their absolute wealth level. So I mean, you can be you can be just as happy as like some tribesman in Africa with like a fucking goat in a hut, as you could be being like a middle class guy with like a house in the United States. But the guy living in the trailer park, even though his standard of living is objectively far superior to that of the African tribesman with the goat, is probably not as happy and content with his life.
Yeah, but the important thing is
better to rule in hell
than serve in heaven. Yeah, exactly. There's a reason that line from Milton resonated. Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. Well, better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. Yes. Go ahead.
And let's tie this back to what we were talking about just a minute ago, though, too, with the idea of you have different elites that are, closer to a prestige hierarchy than a dominance hierarchy, right? So it's not only your relative status that matters, but it's the people that have status and power over you. How much do you like them, right? So like, it's one of those things that's always bandied about whenever people complain about economic inequality is nobody complains that big football stars make millions of dollars, right? People are like, oh, he's awesome. And in fact, they'll say, this guy's a great football player. Look how much money he makes, right? Like, we like that. We like that when we see people that we respect and we think deserve their money to have money.
Elon Musk. Elon Musk
that we hate who are successful.
Elon Musk. Case in point, right? Like, a few years ago, he's like, Mr. Electric Vehicle and solar power, and like, the blue people are like, oh, we love Elon Musk, he's great. And then like, he starts like, well, being like, modern day Elon, and suddenly his billions of dollars are a problem,
Or Donald Trump.
Or Donald Trump. Yeah, exactly.
And so and I think that's the thing. So when you break down when the societies get smaller, it's much easier to match up. Who are the elites? Are they elites I can respect? As it gets bigger, you're kind of all stuck with that one size fits all problem.
This touches on something that I wrote about a while ago. I can't remember the name of the essay, but it's something like national globalism versus global nationalism, something like that. But basically, like, the idea was like, so we have these elites, but they don't feel like our elites because they've essentially become their own tribe, right?
Yeah.
So like, there was that woman from the left, I don't know, probably a couple of years ago now, who she made some statement, at the World Economic Forum to the effect of like, oh, it's so wonderful that we're building all of this trust between ourselves, between the elites. They actually referring to themselves as that. And we can accomplish so much when we work together, and this is just all great. But what's troubling, she says, is that in every single one of our countries, so the closer we get together as an elite, like the more the people distrust us. And she was very confused and frightened by this.
That was a fantastic quote.
Yeah, I mean, it was so revealing, right? But it's also kind of obvious because like the more that happens, the more they are just their own tribe. And if they're their own tribe, then they're not the elite of our tribe. They're some foreign tribe which is dominating us, right? And this is this kind of strikes this strikes at like kind of like the right into the soul, because it's one thing to live in an autocratic system where at least like the nobility are the kind of the best of your own people, right? Like I guess like to the American political imagination, that would be tyranny because it's an autocracy. But historically, like that's freedom. That is the definition of freedom, is to be ruled by your own. And the definition of servitude is to be ruled by another people, right? It isn't. Yeah, yeah. I see you making a face here because you're thinking like, but Adam Smith or something.
But John,
Yeah,
I'm glad,
I can
I'm
kind of.
glad that you mentioned servitude.
But like,
I was going to bring up. Yeah.
But if you look at like what the struggles for freedom all through history were largely
I think I agree.
national liberation struggles, right? It was like, we don't want to be dominated by this foreign empire. We don't really want to be dominated by this other tribe. We want to live according to our customs and our rules and our traditions, and be ruled by our own elite. So that, and so to tie that back to the discussion, of course, and this is another one of the issues, is that the elite are not perceived by a large fraction of the population as having that kind of emergent organic legitimacy. Which
Yeah.
right. So, and again, that sort of points towards fragmentation, right? Which might not be, because everyone I think when everyone thinks of like national divorce, usually there's this, like one of the arguments against it is people say like, oh well, where would you draw the border, right? Because if you look at like voting patterns, like that's not obvious at all, because it's kind of like rural red counties versus blue states and blue cities, and you've got like blue cities in the middle of like red states, and your blue states are seas of red themselves with like little blue dots in them. But that, I think, might be looking at it entirely the wrong way. It might not be sort of like a red-blue divide. It might be more like just a total fragmentation down into like state, like city states and regional states, that maybe, and this is one of the things that I mentioned last week, I think, might not even play out as a formal breakdown in political unity. I could very easily see a situation where at a de facto level, the federal government is essentially rendered irrelevant to the lives of individual people, but everyone still sort of continues paying lip service to membership in the union. But governors and mayors of the larger cities are pretty much just acting as their own local rulers, doing whatever the fuck they want. Sort of like a Holy Roman Empire situation, right? Where it's like, on paper there's an emperor, but in practice each little baron is doing whatever the fuck he pleases.
Well, and really that was the state's prior 1860 /
sure
14 or so.
It would be, well, this is the thing. It would be a reversion to what America was intended to be from the beginning, basically.
A revolution, you might say.
Yeah, indeed. But it would also to tie this back to the elite theory stuff, right? You would essentially then form a myriad of tiny little elites, a myriad of tiny little hierarchies, all of which you can climb to the top of if you want. So now suddenly there's more space, there's more social space created in the political and economic elite and such, right? Just spinning off that, I'm thinking more, and like the fragmentation of the internet actually into like all of these little walled gardens, kind of a similar thing, right? You've got, if you've got like one big platform everyone uses, and there's only so much attention that can be directed towards the small number of like multi-million follower influencers. But if you've got like 100 or 1,000 different platforms people are fragmented among, then each of those is going to have its own little hierarchy of influencers that it's possible to join and climb up. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad just to return, because it's been a while, but we were talking about the that fortunate quote that we got from the WEF woman about trust, and it was fascinating to me. And the reason that was fascinating, and I haven't seen anybody talk about it yet, is that what is trust in a situation like that? When we look at the entire history of empire or of aristocracy or of anything that touches on the elites, what we know is palace intrigue. That's the actual story. The actual story is that the elites are constantly in secret conflict with each other. It's like real Game of Thrones type shit. You know what I mean? But really echoed throughout history
I'm
is
not.
the
I'm not
idea
sure.
of.
I'm not sure
But
that's
go
totally
ahead.
true, though. I'm not sure it's
Well,
totally
not
true.
totally true. Well, let me get it out
That's
first.
true. That's true in a lot of cases. That tends to be towards the end of the cycle.
But trust, but the idea that trust that she senses, in other words, that there has been, at least up until this time, a trust vacuum. In other words, she's addressing it. This is a discomfort to them. The idea that they may be in league with people who have knives behind their back, which is not always the case, I agree, but is largely the case, or at least often the case. And so I think that, and again, we're talking about global homo, we're talking about global fascism, the idea of large institutions, large mechanisms that are getting into bed with each other, that are making arrangements behind the scenes. And that is, and the one thing that most of those mechanisms entail is that, like, well, like any sort of organization is going to need some element of trust, and they're going to need to have some bedrock, some principle by which they could say, I know I can trust you, right? And oftentimes that principle is based in something, if an organization gets large enough, I think, and powerful enough, it's based in something that's not so great. It's based on, I know your secrets and you know mine. It's based on, I know where the bodies are buried, or something along those lines. And so, I think the unique moment that we're in, because I agree with you guys that, like, the tendency is towards decentralization. I'm seeing it on multiple fronts. It's happening. They are afraid of that for obvious reasons. But I think that our project, part of the idea, like I said, like, okay, civil war, like what would civil war entail? Or a national divorce, that's absent civil war. Well, a national divorce that's absent civil war would be mainly a information war on the one hand, and an economic war on the other hand. And in both cases, when I was rereading Etienne de la Bossie's discourse on voluntary servitude this morning to prepare for this conversation, and like him, I believe that the idea is simply something along the lines of tune in, turn on, and drop out in a new sort of a frame of mind where we say we could coordinate removing consent from various subsystems within society. If we could coordinate, we could say, like, we figure out, okay, here's a test, here's how we know we can trust you. And B, I think part of that would be in the coordination of saying, hey, let's boycott Target tomorrow. We saw the boycotts of Target or Bud Light. Hey, let's boycott this tomorrow. Hey, let's do that. Let's show strength in terms of saying that we can decide not to consent. We can decide not to participate in a large enough a number that it will hurt you. Not with bullets and bombs. It will hurt you. It will knock the dirt from beneath your feet. And, like, I think that, so that when I think about national divorce, I'm just sort of like, how about, a national guma? How about, like, you find people in the world, not just in the country, but in the world, that are willing to say, hey, we also dissent from this maniacal machine. Yeah.
A national guma?
Sorry. I'm just saying, like, in the sense that, like, okay, in other words, we can cheat rather than divorce, and we could cheat with each other on a global scale.
Yeah.
Like,
what's a guma?
Guma, it's an Italian American slang for, like, a kind of a second secret wife.
I knew that.
You never heard guma?
I heard that the first time on the Sopranos, like, which I watched.
Okay, yeah. Like a side piece. I don't know. But I'm saying, if like the side piece could be global. Like, in other words, we all say we coordinate our actions along, again, blockchain or whatever kind of methods we can find to maximize privacy along private networks. To be able to coordinate, it would be way better. I mean, like, what I see all the time is provocation. Like, when I saw Biden's horrible speech that he did in Independence Hall that time, and all he did was just provoke. What they see is that ancient strategy. They say, they look at and they say, like, we gotta get rid of them now. Well, they're still disorganized. Well, they're still confused. Whether they still lack any sort of unifying spirit or symbol or coordinated strategy. Like, so they want to provoke all of these little actions. They want to provoke all of these, foment all of these pointless actions, these that will just allow them to wrap their tentacles around the thing even harder. And I'm like, well, no, what we should be doing now is basically saying, hey, how do we involve ourselves? How do we disentangle ourselves from them? Not just at a national level, I think, at a global level to some degree. How do we disentangle ourselves from them and like ignore them until they sort of fall apart on their own? And Harrison, go ahead. Sorry, man.
Well, no, that was all good. I wanted to come back to something you were talking about just a couple of minutes before that on the issue of trust. And I think another angle of looking at that has to be very granular, like in the actual experiences of people in their everyday lives, because I think that despite kind of the political scheming and backstabbing and stuff that goes on, I think a lot of what contributes to that trust goes back in a sense to what John was saying about merit, and like what a real meritocracy would look like. And the reason I say this is kind of, well, I read a paper recently by a guy that I interviewed for Mind Matters, which will go up this week, Clive Boddy, who's like a business professor, and he deals with like organizational phenomena and corporate psychopathy and job satisfaction. And in one of his papers, he started out by saying, quoting some statistics that were done in the 90s. So this is might be out of date, might be worse or better today. But apparently something like 60% of or more of employees, just in like, corporations and businesses, hate their managers. They think their managers are, of course, like incompetent. And not only that, something like 70% of them would willingly take a pay cut if the manager was fired. So if the head of the corporation or the business said, okay, we'll fire the manager, but you're gonna have to take a pay cut, they would take it and they would be happy with it. That's how much they hate the middle management. So that, of course, creates an environment of distrust and just being miserable at their job. It, of course, reduces their enjoyment and their output, their production capacity. They don't want to be there. They don't want to work. So they become lazy. They start screwing up. But if they have a good boss, a good manager, they actually like their job. That is the one, like, having a good boss, a good manager is, according to at least this study, is the primary contributor to job satisfaction.
It's
not
huge.
actually what you're doing.
It is
right?
huge. Yeah.
So scale that up to the politics. This gets back to that Wef woman quote. It's like the reason people don't trust their elites is, I'd argue, for a similar reason, and kind of going back to what John said, they're a different tribe. We don't trust them, not even just because they're a different tribe, but because they're bad bosses. They don't give us any reason to trust them, to feel like they're one of us. And of course, being part of the same tribe is a big part of that.
And what else makes it worse, because you say, like, this paper was published back in the 1990s, right? So that was also the era in which you started seeing corporations adopt this kind of bring your whole self to work, we're a big corporate family, employee of the month award kind of culture, right? Where it's like, oh, workers need to feel valued. So then instead of like
in a fake
having
way.
Exactly, it is all this fake shit, which then it actually makes it harder to establish trust, because like everyone just kind of rolls your eyes and it's like, yeah, whatever, you learned how to do that in a management seminar, like this is just a fucking act you're putting on, right? Which, to scale that up to the political culture as a whole, is one of the problems, because in a representative democracy, you have this politician class who basically are professional liars, and actors who are professional liars, but literally, and that, so it doesn't matter what they say. It's sort of like, these are just words, like you're just saying what you need to say in order to get power, and it robs the word of all power, right? So I mean, we went from a society where your word was your bond, a society like oath keepers, where oath breaking was like a serious failing, to a society where the word is just valueless, and there is no social justice. Sorry, Eric, your hand's been up for a while.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, but I'm going to completely change directions. Completely. I'm going to turn back to Mark's point about a national sidecorn, which I don't want to stretch the national divorce metaphor too far. But might be taken a little bit far. But I think that the value.
By the way, I just want to say, national Sidepiece has to be the title of this episode.
Well, I think it's like national sidecorn, but it suffers the same problems that all of those sorts of situations tend to have. Is that your main corn? Main piece. I'm not sure. I don't have the dialogue for this or the words, but where does corn come from? I never heard that. I don't know why it was shucking side corn, but that's
where I never heard that one.
Where you have lots of corn. Corn
diversity
is very different where I'm from than it does apparently everywhere else.
Do they even do adultery in Iowa? I thought you got like a scarlet letter.
But anyway, so the main problem with having your mistress that you run off with, Mark, like you said, and you're kind of your second society that you're really part of, is that your main society, in our case, the federal government, tends to get really pissy and jealous about it. And so it's a constant race of one-upsmanship. It's like, can you get more secretive? Can you be more detached and separate? And
but that's why I said that's. But let me just say, that's why I said Guma in particular, because Guma is a little bit different than the side piece. Guma is something where, like a more traditional, again, Italian mistress, where the wife knows.
Yeah.
The wife is aware, and the wife is okay with it as long as it doesn't interfere with certain elements of the family and the contributions.
I was going to get to that.
So I just wanted to interject with that, because in that model, the wife is cool with it.
Kind of. She accepts it.
Kind of.
And I want to use the word accept as opposed to just being cool with, because there's two aspects of this that I think make it not a long-term solution, right? On the first part, as for most people, this starts getting to be a really high transaction cost process, right? Like you're just to stick with the side piece metaphor, you're living two parallel lives basically, and you're always like looking over your shoulder, making sure, did I make sure this is okay? Oh shit, did I leave something laying around? Is there lipstick on my collar? All this kind of silly shit, right? Most people can't keep that up. And you see the same thing now with people. Not many people have escaped to saying, oh, we use only Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. Nothing we do is traceable by the government. Most people don't have a VPN. It's all this kind of stuff that's relatively easy, but most people can't be bothered. They want to live somewhere where how they happen to live is the okay way to live as far as the government's concerned, right? They're trying to lower all these transaction costs. It takes weirdos like us to really kind of start pushing a little bit and saying, oh no, well, if I do this, they have no idea what, you know what I mean? Like take that kind of stuff real seriously. And as the government ramps that up,
we're also
raise the price.
I mean, with the kind of adultery metaphor here, implicit in all of this discussion so far is that we're the husband and not the abused wife who is locked at home, whose finances are wholly controlled by the controlling abusive spouse, who also happens to be a mob boss who can have us snuffed out at a moment's notice, owns the courts, has dirty cops on the lookout, can take your kids away, which is maybe
that's very much the best
reality of the situation, right? It's like we're
yeah, and exactly, and that's the thing. That's kind of what I wanted to get back with the Guma or whatever, the acceptance of sidecorn, is that sooner or later the other one changes their mind, right? They start wanting things, they start seeing too much conflict, and it becomes really difficult to do that. And then when it comes in conflict, it only goes one way, right? When the abusive
we're talking
angry,
right, but we were talking about the wife is abusive in this mob. The wife is evil. The wife is
the abusive one eventually decides that they don't want to put up with it anymore, and since it's still a very one-sided power relationship in the sense that one side has a gun that's going to kill you and the other one isn't, it can't go on forever, right? Eventually you get some sort of conflict. With individual human relationships, it sometimes works out better because they eventually get old and stop caring. You know, your dick falls off or whatever, and you no longer care about having an affair, or, you know, you just die. But
all right, let's add another
that keeps going for quite some time.
Let's add another layer to this metaphor then that I started, and I'm not totally married to myself. I was kind of a joke, but let's add one more layer. And let's say the wife is a drug addict. Let's say the wife is addicted to some very powerful things, have very self-destructive behaviors.
Are we talking like
the wife is the one that we're stepping out on? The wife's the government.
Okay.
The wife is the government, is GAE, global homo, whatever you want to say. The wife is the elites. The wife is the people, the people who are who pretend to rule over us, and in many ways do. And that this is a very sick spouse. This is a spouse that is addicted to many self-destructive behaviors, that is circling the drain in many ways. And
but
so
but is also emotionally
also dangerous,
abusive, who
emotionally abusive and dangerous,
who's like borderline, you know, and has been
borderline personality, schizophrenic, sociopathic.
Exactly, has been relentlessly undermining your self-esteem for, like, you know, decades. You know, like,
look, essentially, I'm describing two of my ex-girlfriends, so I have knowledge in this sphere. And so what I'm saying is that sociopathic, self-destructive, drug addicted, someone who is temperamental, who is dangerous, but who is also doing quite a bit of damage to themselves in the meantime. And so what I'm saying is the guma, the side corn, which is interesting, the side piece, whatever we want to call it, would be, in other words, freedom-loving peoples around the world who also maybe are fleeing from their own destructive, decaying, abusive, sociopathic partners. And that, like, if we could, instead of a national divorce, I guess what I'm saying is, like, rather running under the radar, well, the inevitable takes its course, because inevitably, I think that, you know, these structures are going to fall in our lifetimes. I don't think there's much we can do about it. You know, we've tried to help her, we've tried to save her, and we can't. I think is what is the whole reason that this national divorce topic comes up, is because I think so many of us.
Consider for a moment the fact that this conversation is happening with this group right now, right? So, like, you know, who do we, like, the five of us on this call, and the two of the group who are not here, but they're, you know, in kind of the same socioeconomic educational class, you know, like, we're all, like, you know, fairly educated, we're, you know, middle-aged, which is supposed to be de-radicalized, you know, the conservative milquetoast, middle of the road, you know, like, professional types. We're not backwoods Michigan militia types, right? Like, you know, talking about, like, the inevitable war with Zog or whatever, like you would have had back in the 1990s, who would have been the people in the 90s who would have been having these kinds of conversations about, you know, the necessity of pulling away from the global homo regime. They would have called it Zog back then, but whatever. The fact that people like us are talking about this, right, I think is actually incredibly salient, because we're not the only ones talking about it. This conversation is happening, like, across the world right now. And that, I think, like, although we haven't started cheating yet, we are definitely emotionally cheating, right? Which is kind of the first step in that. Like, you know, we've kind of, like, severed that tie in our hearts towards this system entirely. You know, people who, like us, who were maybe a bit dissatisfied 20, 30 years ago would have been like, oh, well, you know, it can be fixed. Like, we just have to tweak this and change that and it'll all be good. Like, that's what the conversation would have been. And now it's just kind of like the widespread sense is, yeah, there's nothing here that can be salvaged. It's done. It's over. We have to start again. But The other thing I was going
following
to
that
say,
analogy with the, spouse or the girlfriend who's like, a narcissist and abusive and everything. It's like, say you have somebody, the halo's been on them because you're in love and you're like, oh, they wouldn't cheat on me. People will tell you, oh, I saw so-and-so with, and an idiot, naive think, no, there's no way, she's really in love when she says this thing, she really means it. And then, 5 or 6 other guys are saying the same thing. And at some point, the light bulbs come on and it's like the people who are being cheated on or being played kind of compare notes a little bit and say, oh, and it's kind of like, all kind of waking up at the same time. Like, I guess what you see back in the day on those daytime talk shows where the wine women would, be on and the kind of finally connect after realizing they were all dating the same guy or whatever,
Yeah,
it's kind of the situation we're in now.
And the side piece is the soft landing. Okay, sorry.
Well, let me just jump on. Let me finish jumping on you, and then we'll come back. But and I was going to say, I was going to defer to Harrison's clinical knowledge here, but I was always told that the advice given to people in abusive relationships with like dangerous, self-destructive people wasn't, hey, just ride it out until they get done killing themselves. It was usually, get the fuck out now. Get out, run, go somewhere else. Let them kill themselves on their own time. Right? So while on the one hand, I agree with you, but I think that's where, to the extent the analogy holds, I think that really is where it should take you, other than the idea of saying, if you can get out and they don't even know that you're out, so they don't know to chase you, which I think is kind of generally what we're getting at here. That's sort of the equivalent of the side piece. If you can get out and they don't even know to be angry at you, great. But you got to get out, period. Getting out's the main focus. And if you can do it subtly so they don't realize you've left, so much the better. But
best of all,
where are we going to go?
Well,
yeah, that would be nice.
That's the case with national divorce, is just say, look, we're not sharing the same country anymore. Or in that case, United States, we're not sharing the same federal government anymore.
Yeah, but then they come and cut your throat in the middle of the night. Like that this is the problem. This happens in abusive relationships all the time. It's like, I'm finally leaving you. And guess what happens? 9 times out of 10, particularly if it's like a woman that's leaving a man, you're gonna get some bad situations that happen. If you just straight up say, I'm leaving you. Yeah, best case scenario is they leave you. This one, though, is drug addicted, is completely insane. Is in control of all the purse strings.
You're not going to be having an adult, divorce, right?
Exactly. Like it's kind of. And see, and this is the thing. This is where the metaphor breaks down a little bit. Is that, if Texas was going to ask me my advice about, hey, we're thinking of having a vote or a referendum on whether or not to leave the United States, my first piece of advice would be, cool, call up the National Guard on the day before. Have that shit ready, right?
Yeah.
In case of a woman, I'd say, go somewhere else and make sure you have a gun that night. That kind of thing. And
right, so then we're the woman.
I mean, like, and it might well get ugly. But I think at the same time, it gets uglier the longer you stay with it. Ugliness is bound to happen. The question is, are you going to be ugly on your terms and on your turf, and thus maybe be able to diffuse the situation? But by saying, if you try to force this, like if you try to force a remainder in the union, there's going to be bloodshed and we'll fight you over it. Or you could just let us go and no one has to get hurt. That's a different position than we agree that you have the right to hurt us as you see fit, when you see fit, and please just don't do it too much.
The other thing too there is like the money piece. I mean, it's almost like if you have this abusive spouse, they have this inheritance that they got, or they got all this money, or they control the money somehow. In this case, it's not that the blue tribe can really hurt the red tribe. It's like they have the money to hire the professional hitman to basically do it for them. So it's like once that money runs out, and that's the thing. It's like you look at the amount of debt in the system now and see how with the weaponization of the dollar against Russia, how that's kind of backfired hilariously in a way, with the BRICS currency.
So what you're saying,
once that happens,
what you're saying is we need to start dating Russia.
Well, I don't know about that. I'm just.
I thought we were trying to get out of the drunken,
that,
abusive
that
relationship.
anything that's gonna like our elites getting into a pissing match with Xi or Putin or whoever and bankrupting themselves and then no longer being able to pay for their control mechanism. That's an awesome scenario. I mean, obviously it's going to suck.
It's like Napoleon.
There's like a big time economic pain for everybody here, because it's going to be a huge change to our standard of living, but it's kind of like the least bad outcome out of a laundry list of terrible outcomes. And the worst, if we don't do anything, it's like they just keep tightening the control mechanisms on us, and you get the digital programmable currency from the central bank, and they perfect their surveillance and get AI up to speed to surveil us and all that, and turn your bank account off if you say the wrong thing or whatever. Next thing you know, I mean, that's just the thing. It's like a slow march to slavery.
There's also I wasn't in on the competence crisis conversation, but I did watch it afterwards. We can't pay no attention to the fact that these people are getting dumber, that these aristocrats are inbreeding, that it is getting worse and worse. I see like these madcap plans.
But this actually works perfectly well with your analogy to the drug addict, right? Because what happens to someone who's all strung out on hard drugs over time? Their minds and bodies degenerate, right? This is kind of what it is. It's like they're strung out on smack. They're not nearly as hot as they were, a generation ago. Like the shines come off. They're
our
barely
elites are like Amber Heard, and then you see the video of her testimony. Everybody finds out she shits on his bed, and
she's shitting in the bed.
She's
breaking her own bank. Yeah, they're breaking their own banks. They're shitting the bed. This is who I see like as the spouse. It's not like the noble spouse. It is a monster of its own self-creation that is eating itself. And so, again, I'm going to try to get away. I'm going to try to untangle myself from this metaphor.
With your whole beat, I mean, did they create themselves, or is this like this egregore kind of thing where there's, they're under the influence of something?
Well, that's what I think. I mean, like, I'm not gonna pull you guys into all of that. Eric's here, for God's sake. But
we are
one of the original people talking about that. I just like to say
my biblical metaphor is going to be way off here. It's like we're Solomon and they're Jezebel kind of thing, introducing devil worship.
Well,
maybe Lot and his wife. I don't know.
Well, to jump onto this metaphor too, like what Daniel was saying, is that it's important to remember that at the national level, when we're talking about national divorce, the elites don't generate wealth. Right, they get it from the bottom up. Right, it's all the people that work and create things, pay their taxes into the federal government. That federal government then uses those taxes to buy other things. So, if you say, I'll just stick with Texas. Texas decides they're going to leave the union. They have one of the larger economies. I think they're top 20 in the world. Okay.
Yeah.
That money comes directly. That money goes away from the federal government and it stays with Texas.
So a couple months ago, Simplicius, the thinker at Dark Futura, had an extended piece on exactly these kinds of dynamics, right? And that was one of the things he pointed out, was that the red states are actually the net revenue generators in terms of like the real economy, and that's going to become
you have to distinguish between the financial bullshit economy and real producing tangible goods and services.
Exactly, 100%.
New York, 1,000% paper money bullshit.
Exactly. So like in the blue states, their GDP looks huge because they have these very active sort of extractive fire economies. But the actual like tangible wealth generation is happening in red states. And increasingly the entrepreneurial activity is happening in red states as well. Tesla moving to Texas is one example of that. So, and then like as the population sorting continues, that's going to be even more the case, because you're sort of like more ambitious, productive people are going to be moving to the red states. thus their economies will get stronger. The blue states are going to they're already seeing their tax revenue decline. Real estate values are going down in city centers, which is also hurting tax revenues. And they've got all of these very expensive social entitlement programs to sort of for the care and feeding of the urban underclass that they've nurtured over the decades, that they are increasingly unable to afford. So the sort of scenario that he pointed to as a possible fracture point is that because the blue states have a lock on national politics, like they're not giving up control of Washington anytime soon. Like they will, by hook or by crook, maintain that. Very likely, at a certain point, they're just going to be like, okay, well, we're just going to start pillaging the red states, by the federal government just like appropriating what they have and, sending it to the blue states. Well, this is going to really piss off the red states, right? It's one thing to be talking about like ideology and child trannies and, all of this fucking nonsense. It's an entirely other thing when it's hitting you directly in the pocketbook and like they're taking money out of your communities and sending it to communities full of people you really don't like very much. And that, I think, would be, he made a pretty good case. I think that would be something that would ultimately motivate populations and state governors to just say, you know what, we're out. Like, but then that, of course, puts the blue states in a very awkward position because how are they going to pay for all their stuff? And, layered on top of that, these red state people are a bunch of infidels and heretics because they are not doing the child tranny thing and so on and so forth. And now you set up the conditions for religious war because the only way for the blue states to maintain their financial control of the red states is now at the point of a gun.
Yeah. I'm glad that you put it that way in terms of the holy war, because that's what I saw as well. I was just sort of like, what? When I thought about like people that are proponents, because I did read a bunch of proponents of national divorce and also some proponents of civil war, by the way. And in both cases, first of all, in the first case of national divorce, I saw it devolving into some kind of violence anyway, because think about the enemy, the perfect enemy that you would be creating there. This blue state empire of people that have become detached from reason, that have become detached from ethics, from morality, from even basic logic, and who are then are being burned. They're being burned. They're finally feeling the flame of debt that they've never felt before, and the weight of all that debt suddenly coming down on them, I think would spark something like a zombie apocalypse almost. And I'm not really kidding. Like, I think that like you might see people that are just absolutely they've been trained to say, those people took from you, go get them, and it would be bedlam, which is why I think
and to make it worse, right? So it's not just that they would have like a mercenary motive, which helps, frankly, but it's tied up with this like religious aspect of we're fighting for gay rights or or racial justice or you all know the thing. So they would have this, and this has been the pattern with woke from the beginning, right? Is like they have all of this like rhetoric about like their high ideals, but ultimately it just comes down to money and power, right? It's an excuse for that. It's a very effective combination, and this you're 100% correct. This would supercharge it. And they would get, I think they would be pretty desperate. Now, as Daniel pointed out, like in this scenario, it's likely they'd be a lot poorer, which would make it much more difficult for them to fund, a large military campaign. Like, would they really be able to maintain the logistical train necessary to keep the modern American war machine in the field?
Yes, I'll tell you.
But the same considerations would very likely apply to the breakaway red states. So, Eric, one of the things that he pointed out in his introduction was, okay, the national debt. like how do you decide like how that gets divvied up? Now, I mean, I'm a bit ruthless, so like my sort of preference would be fuck you, that's your problem. Like we didn't want this. You deal with it, Washington. But would the international markets be satisfied with that answer? Probably not, right? So they could have a hard time getting financing,
but they would be betting on winners, though, John. Like in any war that broke out in this country,
right? So here's the thing, right? It would come down to a matter of who is backing them, right? Because like in this scenario, the U.S., the entire or the remnants of the U.S., the rump United States, and whatever breaks away from it, or maybe it would be like two rival claimants both claiming to be the legitimate federal government. That could very easily happen as well. They're all bankrupt effectively, and so now you need foreign resources. Okay, so now it's going to be a matter of who is Brazil and China and Russia and maybe the European Union going to throw their backing.
Maybe Iran.
Maybe Iran, exactly. I mean, there's a lot of Japan. There's a lot of possibilities out there. Once the U.S. disappears as a global hegemon, which happens pretty much the next day after the U.S. breaks up, then you have all of these regional powers popping up, right? Some number of whom are probably going to take some interest in military happenings in the former continental United States. Is there interest in this side or that side winning? Is there interest in the conflict being prolonged as long as possible and being as destructive as possible? If I was super Machiavellian, like you'd be like, well, look what the Chinese do, actually, historically, right? What China's foreign policy historically has been to support the weaker side in any given border conflict amongst the barbarians until that side becomes the stronger side, and then to divert their support to the now weaker side. And that way, that conflict just simmers on and simmers on and simmers on, and neither side is able to ever get particularly strong, and then no one can challenge the Middle Kingdom. I see no reason why they wouldn't apply something quite similar.
I agree.
So like it starts
that's exactly what I imagine.
Yeah. So I mean, then this was this like national divorce situation rapidly collapses into just like a permanent conflict. That could go for decades and decades and decades, and just absolutely
we become the forever war battlefields like Ukraine or like Afghanistan, except like
right.
Yeah, I think probably
hoist it on our own petard.
Some of these other countries, that would put a wrinkle in this is like which side, red versus blue, is most likely to interfere in the other nations abroad. It's like the blue tribe, the neocons have all gravitated towards there. So it's like if there's two governments, which one's most likely to
right? So Dan, like the way it would probably play out, if I was a betting man, because you're right, the red state people are the ones who are right now isolationists. Just leave us the fuck alone. We don't want this stupid empire anymore. We want to focus on our own problems. And it's the neocons they're very much on the blue side. So if I were China and we were to end up in the situation, I would be throwing my financial support and my military support and whatever behind the red states. But I would only do that, until the red states were doing pretty well for themselves. Right. And then, would start, helping out the blue states. And, maybe you're even funding both sides at the same time. Right. You could be like, helping one side above board and then like, using back channels to send resources to the other side. The global financial forces have done this. I mean, like many times in the past, both of the great wars of the 20th century saw the financial markets simultaneously supplying and, both sides of the conflict. IBM manufacturing machinery for the Germans, or the Coca-Cola Corporation spinning off Fanta to to help. I mean, you have this kind of stuff happening all the time. So,
if I could offer a little bit more optimistic view on this, though, I think the argument that it would go directly to full-out civil war is possibly a little overstated, or at least overly pessimistic, I think. There's a couple of things the United States has in its favor for avoiding that a lot of other places around the world don't. One, even with the red-blue divide, we have a much more consistent culture and lack of, I guess you would say, historical grievances than almost everywhere else on Earth, right? Like, I talk shit about Californians all the time, but if I meet one in a bar, I'm not going to sneak out and beat them up later.
I don't know, man. A lot of Southern boys I've talked to have some pretty deep-seated grievances, but
they still likewise, don't do that much. I know quite a few too who likewise talk a lot about how much they hate them, but they don't actually act on it. Very
likewise, you're African Americans vis-a-vis, white Americans.
Well, exactly, and that there's a small portion in some parts of the cities that are really bad about that, right? I totally agree with that, but I think it's a very small portion compared to places like Kosovo and like the former Balkans, where it's like these people have hated each other and been fighting over things.
Oh yeah, I know.
Great grandfathers said
talking about
20 years
talking
ago.
to Balkanoids is kind of hilarious. The Serbs, Kosovars are all dogs, and then you talk to the Kosovars, like Serbs are all fucking Nazis.
And
they really hate each other.
Yeah, and I think
during the George Floyd riots, like I mean, so I was on under my as a personal account, like in social media at that time, and interacted with some people that I was surprised to see how many people you couldn't have even a nuanced conversation with about it. Not just that, but people that were like celebrating the prospect of racial violence, and not just Black people. I mean, white people that are, allies or whatever, but like people that celebrated as if this is going to be a great thing. And I'm, trying to push back like, hey, I don't think you realize what the genie that you're letting out of the bottle when you do this. And especially, I mean, just as a tactical, strategic thing, even if you feel like it's justified, if you're Black, you're 13% of the population advocating, which unfortunately too many prominent people in the politically Black, and you got to distinguish that. It's not just Black. It's like there's a political identity around it. Too many people in that camp are comfortable and have, said things kind of indicating a support for and hope for that type of violence to happen, to inflame that type of grievance and all that. And it's like you're 13% of the population. It's not a winning strategy, especially.
Well, and that was the thing, and that was my second point, Daniel, though, is that especially with the George Floyd riots, when you saw that sort of violence happening, it wasn't that those folks were driving out into the countryside and burning down farms, right? They were going into, and I saw this directly in Minneapolis because I was living right outside of it. They were going into Minneapolis and they were burning down, one, their own neighborhoods, and two, other minority neighborhoods. Like there was a lot of focusing on things like, Hispanic and Korean beauty salons, and even a lot of people, at the time or anyways, this seems actually pretty racial, like very racially motivated in terms of like Blacks were going after other minorities and other minorities were going after Blacks. And so I think part of this is that, this racial war thing, it isn't these like real clear camps. It's people in the cities hate the other people around them in the cities. And they're the ones that are going after it. None of them are thinking, we've got to drive out to the boonies and set a few barns on fire.
Well, this actually, to go back to the Balkans analogy, because I've read people who have actually made a direct comparison of the U.S. to the pre-war Balkan states, because of and not just the U.S. but sort of like the West more broadly. Shit, and look what happened in France last week. We've spent the last couple generations, especially the last like 10, 15, 20 years, really packing the diversity into our urban centers. And pretty much every city in every Western country right now is this patchwork of ethnic ghettos, and they all hate each other, right? You know, I mean, like when people talk about black versus white, that's a thing, but you know, Somali versus African American, definitely a thing in like, you know, Michigan, for example, or is it Minnesota?
Minnesota,
But like,
yeah.
I mean, in Minnesota, yeah, right, or like, you know, down in like the southern states, it's like, you know, black versus Hispanic, for example. And then of course there's like the Asians who like, you know, don't go looking for trouble as a rule, but we all remember the rooftop Koreans from Rodney King. Um, so like the point
Okay, I
is,
don't think.
if
Okay, but like
if
most people
if stuff
don't go. Yeah.
if stuff were to kick off like this, right? Um, you probably would not necessarily end up with like sort of 1865 type civil war where you have like, you know, two well-defined, you know, states with borders and uniformed militaries and stuff. It could be far, far, far more chaotic than that.
Yeah.
And
and that,
not
yeah, and that was part
and
of my larger point, is that the United States, particularly United States, it's different in other places, I'm sure, but United States, most of the dysfunction that people are trying to get away from are centered on the cities, right? So if Texas decides they want to leave the Union, Chicagoans might be, oh, this is horrible. Everybody in the rest of Illinois is going to go, lucky bastards, I want to do that, right? They see themselves a lot closer. And the reason that's important is that if the rest of the United States wants to go to war on Texas to make sure they can't leave, a lot of their population is going to go, no, why are we doing that? We shouldn't kill them. Let them leave. They're all right.
well, this actually touches
I want to
on
leave too. These are good guys. You know, these are more like us. They don't. It isn't like, you know, back in the
this
day
this
where all Missourians are bastards and we want to, you know, fuck Missouri. Everybody hates them.
this
The
this
next
touches
Trump
this
could
touches
build
on
a wall around the cities instead of
this
with
All
touches
right, all
on
right, all
a,
right.
border, you know.
this touches
We're
on
clearly
a,
not going to.
touches on
This is not going to
this,
stop today. We clearly have more to say.
it could go on forever.
We've
But
gone for
what I
quite
just,
a while.
we got
Yeah,
to
but
wrap
go
up.
ahead,
But
finish up.
I just want to
Yeah.
throw one more thing out there. It's one thing we didn't touch on at all, but which is I think kind of emerges out of the point that Eric's making, is internal secession, right? So you mean we've already seen several cases that I'm aware of in the U.S. where you have individual counties or small groups of counties who are actively trying to leave their state and just join a different state, right? Which obviously, like, you know, the states that they're trying to leave don't want to let them leave. Washington is not particularly interested in smoothing that because they recognize that would be, in every single case, a diminution of blue state power. But it's, you know, certainly something that, you know, like how exactly do you prevent that, right? So remember, like, you know, for instance, like a few years ago, Virginia under the previous governor was going to roll out some very restrictive firearms legislation that, you know, were arguably a violation of the Second Amendment. And a bunch of the counties were like, we don't like this very much. And then West Virginia was like, hey, if you want to join us, like, you know, our doors are open, right?
Yeah.
So then, like,
West Virginia.
right. So then, you know, this sets up like interesting possibility because, you know, if counties decide to start doing that, like, you know, a lot of these discussions, like they often founder on sort of questions of process, like, oh, like the legislature would never allow it to happen, you know, the courts would never allow it to happen, but power doesn't always work that way. You know, if the counties themselves are like, we're leaving, fuck you, fight me, and you know the other state is like, we're happy to have you here, then like what do you end up with, like shootouts between, you know, various like state national guards and, you know, like standoffs between state patrols, like, I mean, you know,
Well, when you have one side that's like they're modeling their ethos is, you know, liberation from any bonds that you haven't consciously chosen, you know, as you see with the pride bullshit, like, you know, how do they do that when there's, you know, counties of people saying, hey, we don't want to be a part of this thing, and they're like, no, you have to, even if you consciously choose otherwise, we're not going to allow you to be liberated from that. It's just, you know, not to say that logical contradiction has ever stopped the Blue Tribe before, but it just undermines any legitimacy they may have in the eyes of the people they're trying to govern. And that's a big thing when people see the government as an occupation occupational force and not having legitimacy, which is something that's just going to increase.
This is where social contract theory does become like relevant, right? Because I mean, like, even in the era of like divine right of kings, like the king did actually need like the consent of the people, at least insofar as like he is legitimately the king, and he needed to have some level of popularity. But yeah, Mark, you're trying to wrap this stuff up, aren't you?
I wanted to wrap it up very quickly, and I appreciate everything that everyone was saying, and I think a lot of it, again, I'm sounding like a fanboy here, but everyone read Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, written by Etienne de la Boétie in 1571. He's the first substacker in some ways, and I'll leave you with this quote from the piece. I was struggling to find one that would wrap it up, but maybe we could think about this if we decide to extend this conversation into the future. And the quote is this: "Resolve to serve no more, and you are at once freed. I do not ask that you place hands upon the tyrant to topple him over, but simply that you support him no longer. Then you will behold him like a great colossus whose pedestal has been pulled away, fall of his own weight and break in pieces." So, thanks, everybody, for joining us this week. Hope to see you next week on the Tonic 7. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks everyone. Later.
Later.